Say it louder. Good evening, everyone. Oh, it's good to see you here. If you ask anyone about the mission of DSU, they're going to describe it by using words like computers, technology, cyber, and AI. And that's true. We prepare students for careers in all of those areas. But our mission is actually much deeper than that. We prepare cyber-savvy graduates who are lifelong learners, problem solvers, innovators, and leaders who live lives of purpose and positive consequence. To achieve that mission, our students need to understand computers, technology, cyber, and AI through the lens of how they've shaped the fabric of our history. As Dr. David Kenley, our friend, says, we want our students to see that technology is never value neutral and must be guided by responsibility and civic purpose. To that end, in 2021, we launched the annual History and Ethics Forum. Our presenters help us achieve our mission, and I'm particularly excited for this evening's expert who will reintroduce us to the famous South Dakotan Hubert Humphrey. I'll ask Dr. David Kenley to take the podium and introduce that expert, Dr. Samuel Friedman. Please enjoy your evening. Dr. Kenley.
Thank you, Dr. Hoy. Thank you for being here and for your leadership. Good evening and welcome to the 2025 Dakota State University History and Ethics Forum. It's a privilege to open tonight's program, an event that embodies DSU's mission to examine the complex intersections of history, ethics, and civic life. South Dakota has long played an outsized role in shaping American politics and conscience. From Hubert Humphrey's moral courage on civil rights to the leadership of Tom Daschle, John Thune, and Kristi Noem, this state has consistently produced voices that resonate far beyond its borders. Those leaders remind us that the moral questions of one era about justice, equality, and the responsibilities of citizenship echo powerfully into our own. To help us explore those questions tonight, we are honored to welcome a scholar and journalist who has devoted his career to understanding the moral struggles at the heart of American life. Professor Samuel Friedman of Columbia University is one of the nation's most respected chroniclers of the intersections between faith, culture, and politics. Professor Friedman served as a staff reporter for the New York Times from 1981 to 1987, and later wrote its celebrated On Education column from 2004 to 2008. I hope I got those dates right. His work has earned national recognition for its insight and integrity, particularly in the areas of education and religion. He is the author of 10 acclaimed books, works that probe everything from the civil rights movement to the challenges of modern identity in America. Several of these have been finalists for major awards, including the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. Since 1993, Professor Friedman has taught at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, where he has guided generations of writers in finding clarity, purpose, and empathy in their storytelling. His teaching has earned him Columbia's Presidential Award for Outstanding Teacher, one of the university's highest honors. Throughout his career, Professor Friedman has written with rare humility and depth about some of the nation's most divisive issues, always seeking understanding before judgment. His books, including Jew versus Jew and his recent biography of Hubert Humphrey, reflect that commitment to exploring how moral conviction can shape public life. The title of his talk this evening, When Civil Rights Won the White House, captures both the historical significance and the contemporary urgency of that story. Professor Friedman will illuminate the indispensable yet often overlooked role Hubert Humphrey played in placing civil rights at the center of America's national agenda. We are deeply honored to have him with us tonight. Please join me in offering a warm Dakota State University welcome to Professor Samuel Friedman.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kenley. Thank you, Dr. Hoy. As someone who taught journalism ethics for many years, let me, with all accuracy and humility, say I don't have a doctorate. I only have a humble BA. At Columbia University, you're allowed to teach if you did enough in the practical world of newsrooms. And so fortunately, I was able to get in that way. And I'm tremendously honored and flattered to be here, to be speaking as part of this august series, and to share not only the story of the amazing Hubert Humphrey, who's been much too lost to historical memory, but also to bring to light one of the great epics of American history, which is the Civil Rights Movement. And I want to also tell you, again, full disclosure, you may have figured out I'm probably not a native South Dakotan. I'm from the land of oil refineries and strip malls, otherwise known as New Jersey. I was from New Jersey before Springsteen made New Jersey cool. But I did put in my time in South Dakota working on this book. During the 8.5 years I've worked on this book, I made many trips out to the State Historical Society in Pierre and learned how to pronounce it correctly. I did work both East River and West River and learned those terms. But you know the trouble is always going to happen when you put a Jersey boy out in the Dakotas. So I want to start with a story. And in saying to this, it brings to mind an old newspaper editor of mine who once had a great malapropism when he came to talk to us on the staff, and he said, "I come to you today with much humiliation." So I come to you with much humiliation. So this is a guy named Bernard here, who was in his 80s at the time. I was going out to see him in 2019. He lives on the outskirts of Doland, which is where Hubert Humphrey grew up. And if you know some of that territory, about 25, 30 miles north of Huron, about 20 or 40 miles west of Watertown. Anyway, I was obsessed with this question the way historians get obsessed. Dr. Kenley knows what I'm talking about. Of what year Hubert Humphrey's family had to sell their beautiful house because crop prices crashed in the Dakotas in the 1920s. The Dakotas had the Depression a decade before the rest of the country because of what happened to wheat prices. And the Humphreys lost their house. And Humphrey, I began to realize, probably had the year wrong in his own autobiography, and not mendaciously, he wasn't lying for any purpose, he just seemed to have misremembered. But I thought, if I'm going to contradict what he wrote himself in my book, I better be 1,000% sure I've got it right. And I did all these things to try to verify that they had lost their house in 1922, not 1927. And the last step was I found out that this guy Bernard here was the nephew of a farmer who retired from farming and bought the Humphreys house when it was being sold in 1922. And I'd been calling him and calling him and calling him, and no one ever picked up. And of course, I know it'll be a surprise that he didn't have email looking at him there. And so I thought, all right, I'm going out to SDSU to meet with an agronomist, because I also had to teach myself all about wheat diseases. We don't know a lot about stem rust in central New Jersey. We can tell you all about toxic chemicals, though. Anyway, so I thought, all right, I'm going to be in Brookings already. I'm just going to drive up and show up at this guy's house. And so I put my Google map directions in, and it took me up 29 interstate, took me 212, two-lane paved, fine. Took me off 212 heading south. It's gravel, it's okay, because there had been a big thunderstorm the night before. Then I get to what I'm told is 1,000 feet from Bernard here's farmhouse. And the last sign says, "Dirt road, advance at your own risk." And I thought, well, I've come all this way, and Google Maps must be right. And so I turned, and 15 feet later, this is what happened. Okay, the Jersey guy stuck in the mud 1,000 feet from the person he wants to interview. And I can't tell you the shame of having to call up AAA. I was worried they wouldn't even come out there, but they did come out from Watertown. And I thought, I am like the living stereotype. You know, this kid from the suburbs who tries to come out to interview someone in farm country and ends up sinking his car to the axles. Thank the Lord they had pity on me and pulled me out. But being a true journalist, the next thing I did was drive up to Bernard Here's house, interview him for about 20 minutes, verify from his memory that his uncle had bought the Humphrey family's house, and then drove back with my tires making all kinds of weird noises because there was bundles of mud inside the rims. I had to find a tire store in Watertown to take off the tires and clean it all out. Anyway, so that's what brings me here to you. Fortunately, I didn't have any such escapades on the way out here today. And when I'm talking to you today, we're talking at a time when those of us with historical memory, or those of you who want to learn this history, might be turning your minds back roughly 60 years to the period of the mid-1960s when the landmark civil rights laws of this country were passed. Basically, these three big laws: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, if you follow what the Supreme Court cases are, is being challenged right now, and the Fair Housing Act of 1966. And if people even have a cursory knowledge of civil rights, they tend to know those laws the same way they know about Rosa Parks not taking her assigned seat in the back of the bus, or the March on Washington, and so on. And so when we think again about what led up to those laws, we think about the March on Washington. We think about Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. We think about also a lot of the violence that followed that speech, the backlash that inevitably comes on the heels of progress in civil rights in this country. You can be sure, if you're a historian, that every time there's progress in civil rights in this country, there's going to be a backlash. And it took the form of the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, the 16th Street Baptist Church, that killed 4 little girls who were there for Sunday worship service, the assassination of Medgar Evers, the leader of the NAACP in Mississippi, and when the protesters in Birmingham had the fire hoses and dogs turned on them by the now notorious police chief of Birmingham, Bull Connor. So that was also part of what led to the political change of will, the change of national mood that allowed Lyndon Johnson and Dr. King with the mass movement, and Hubert Humphrey helping out as vice president, and earlier than that in the Senate. Am I echoing? Is it okay? All right. Anyway, that led them to be able to accomplish these civil rights laws that people have been pushing for decades. And you know, that's a totally valid story. That's a totally correct story. But it's really an incomplete story. If you think the civil rights saga in this country began with Rosa Parks not taking the seat in the back of the bus in 1955, or with the Brown versus Board of Ed decision outlawing school segregation in 1954, or with the March on Washington in '63, or the Freedom Rides, it started a generation earlier in many ways. And it started with 3 people who even many students of the civil rights movement barely know or don't understand the importance of. These 3 men: Hubert Humphrey, South Dakota's own, President Harry Truman, and a great black labor and civil rights leader named A. Philip Randolph. And their paths converged in 1948, in July 1948. And they were a really unlikely triumvirate to accomplish this epic change in American history, to really set the table in 48 for what would happen in 64 and 65 and 66. Because 2 of the 3, for reasons I'm going to give you shortly, would be among the least likely advocates for the rights of Black Americans that you could ever imagine. Yeah, it is. Thank you. I told her that at dinner that provost is the killer job in a university. You have to do everything at provost. In any case, so let's start with Harry Truman. Harry Truman, some of you, many of you may know, was the president who took office after Franklin Roosevelt died in office in 1945. Harry Truman Prior to that had been the senator from Missouri. And Harry Truman was not only from the border state of Missouri, Harry Truman was from a family history that included people who fought for the Confederacy, people who owned enslaved Black Americans. And so he was someone who, through much of his political career, had evidenced no particular interest in civil rights as an issue. He had other issues, economic equality, cracking down on war defense contractors who were cheating during World War II, but he had never been involved in civil rights at all. But there was a kind of a fundamental decency in Truman that was able to be affected. And here's what affected it. At the time, now something a lot of you may not realize is that the American armed forces were still segregated at this point. The irony is that as the United States went into global war against fascism, with its racial and religious exterminationist ideas, it went into that war still segregating its own military into separate white and black units. And at the end of the war, by the way, we'll hear more about this later, one of the big issues was to desegregate the armed forces. Well, the black soldiers who went into the war had this idea they called double victory. And the idea was, we're going to fight against fascism abroad, that's victory number one, and then we're going to come back and say to America, hey, look at the sacrifice we made for a country that treats us like second-class citizens at best. Now it's time to win the victory against bigotry on the home front. And there were black GIs who came back and immediately got involved in local civil rights activity. And one of them was this man up there, an Army sergeant named Isaac Woodard. And what happens in 1946 is that he's riding a bus through South Carolina, refusing to sit in the back of the bus, and he gets off in a small town to go and use the bathroom. And somehow the sheriff in that town had been alerted to the fact that this black man wouldn't go in the back of the bus, and they found it even more offensive that he's wearing the uniform of his country. And so that police chief arrests Woodard, and while he's in the cell, the police chief gouges out both of his eyes with his nightstick. You can see what his sockets look like. And Woodard, instead of being totally degraded by this episode, goes on national speaking tours for civil rights, and specifically for desegregating the armed forces, to say, how can we be a country of equality if this is what happens to a black war veteran? And Harry Truman found out about that case, and it really changed his heart. It changed his whole view towards civil rights. Harry Truman just could not countenance the idea that a war veteran would have his eyes gouged out. And so suddenly Truman in 46 and 47 begins to take up the cause of civil rights. And this is something, again, to fill in contextually for a lot of you who I wouldn't expect to know this. The Democratic Party, the party of FDR, the party of the New Deal, the party that on most issues was liberal, at this time was also the party of segregation. It was the party of Jim Crow, because in the FDR coalition, there were urban Catholics and Jews, there were intellectuals, there were labor union people, but there was also the Democratic Party of the South, which was totally devoted to segregation. And because blacks couldn't vote in the South, the whites who flocked to the Democratic Party and associated the Republican Party with Lincoln and emancipation and Reconstruction were all Democratic. And FDR, like other national Democratic politicians, needed to appease the Southern wing. And so the Democratic Party had never messed with Jim Crow. It had never challenged segregation in the South. And suddenly Harry Truman is doing things like speaking to the NAACP convention, speaking from the Lincoln Memorial. That's a bit of messaging for y'all. And so he begins to transform the party and certainly his own reputation. He appoints a presidential commission to study civil rights. He introduces its 10 recommendations, including desegregating the Army, in his State of the Union address in 1947. And this is changing immediately the national debate on civil rights. Now, I also don't want to exceptionalize Truman. or even exceptionalize America, because you can't understand what's happening in the 1940s, in the post-war period, unless you remember what had happened during the war, what this country had gone to war against, and what it had seen, what Nazism was. Nazism was exterminationist treatment of Europe's Jews, and also the degradation of black people, the identification of them with animals rather than with human beings. And so after the war is won, against that backdrop, there's an open question for America, which is, having sacrificed what we've sacrificed, having liberated these death camps and seeing what bigotry does as its end product, what are we going to do about our own country? And that was a question also that a lot of American fighting men, because the Army at this point was all men, were asking during the war. This was a period when you had not only that double victory idea, and you can see the logo for it there, but you had the famous Tuskegee Airmen, a group of black aviators who fought against the norms in this country for years to be able to go into combat, for the right to fly combat missions. It was also a time when Jewish GIs went to fight. And you can see in that photograph, if you see a man wearing a combat helmet and wearing a prayer shawl that's called a talit in Hebrew and holding a prayer book, he's leading a Jewish prayer service on liberated German soil. First time the American Army has broken through to Germany. And this was so important on the home front that it was broadcast on NBC Radio live. And also out of that war was the story of the four chaplains. When we talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition, it wasn't a tradition, it was invented during World War II. And it was built up around episodes like this, when an American troop ship, the Dorchester, was sunk by Nazi U-boats. On that ship were four chaplains, two Protestant ministers, one Catholic priest, one Jewish rabbi. And they agreed with each other that they would all minister to each other's people, whoever needed some form of last rites, whatever religion they were, they would give it to them, and they would not go on the lifeboats. They would go down to their deaths. And they did. And they were memorialized, including on this postage stamp, as the four chaplains. And so that whole attitude about the country America has to aspire to become after the war was also part of the backdrop of what Harry Truman was doing as his politics transformed. And then the next person in this unlikely triumvirate is A. Philip Randolph. And A. Philip Randolph was a bold man. A. Philip Randolph, at a time when most labor unions were segregated, would not have black members, created the first really important black labor union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the people who were the porters on the Pullman sleeper cars that took people back and forth across this country by rail. And out of his work with organized labor, he moved into a broader definition of civil rights. He was unafraid of anyone. In 1940 or 41, he goes to meet with Franklin Roosevelt. And he says to Roosevelt, if you won't at least desegregate the defense plants that are making the battleships and the bombers and the bullets and the mortars to win this war against fascism, then I'm going to bring 100,000 black people to Washington to march. The March on Washington in '63 was actually the second one that was intended. The first one was going to be in '41, led by A. Philip Randolph, and you can see the logo on there. Well, not many people were able to intimidate FDR, but A. Philip Randolph succeeded at it. And during the period of the war years, by presidential executive order, defense plants had to be desegregated. And then coming out of the end of the war, A. Philip Randolph's number one issue was to desegregate the armed forces for all the reasons that I described before. And he was once again fearless about it. You can see a photo of him there addressing a congressional committee about it. The people in Congress at that hearing are threatening to try him for treason. The reason they want to try him for treason is that Randolph is saying, if you won't desegregate the military, I'm going to encourage young black men not to register for the draft, not to report for service if they're called up. And it ended up in a kind of a gridlock between him and Harry Truman. As much as Truman was moving forward on civil rights, when he has a meeting in the Oval Office with A. Philip Randolph, and Randolph asks for an executive order. Truman sort of says, well, that would be nice if only we could do it. And that's because Harry Truman, by this time, is starting to think about the 1948 election and thinking about, how am I going to win a term if I lose the whole South, if I lose all those electoral votes? Even the great FDR wouldn't risk alienating the Jim Crow South. And that's where it stands in this, confrontation between Randolph and Truman, who in some ways see the issue very closely, but in terms of their tactics are 180 degrees apart on what to do about it. Well, now let's go to South Dakota. And maybe some of you, how many people have been through Doland here? A few. And Huron, anyone here been through Huron? Okay, a few more. So Hubert Humphrey, as much as Harry Truman, with his ancestry of Confederates and slaveholders, was an unlikely champion for civil rights, same thing with Hubert Humphrey. No, he didn't have any Confederates in the attic. No, he didn't have any slaveholders in his lineage. But he was from a very vanilla place, and he was a very vanilla guy. And Doland, you can see it in the early 1900s in that photo, even at the point Humphrey's growing up there, it's only about 600 people. It's a very parochial, insular place. Almost everybody in town is from either Northern European or Scandinavian ancestry. Virtually everybody in town is Protestant, and what they considered a minority there were Catholics. There was a town of Catholics, Turton. It's about 10 miles north. You see, I know my SD geography. I'm not fooling you all. Turton's about 10 miles up from Doland, and it was mostly French-Canadian immigrants who were Catholic. And periodically, the Ku Klux Klan would show up outside Turton and burn crosses, just to remind Catholics where they stood in the order. So you can imagine that if white Catholics are considered a dangerous alien minority, what black people would have looked like to the people in Doland. I don't mean they would look at them hatefully, but they're completely beyond anyone's immediate field of knowledge or familiarity. And yet this amazing thing happens when Hubert Humphrey's 11 years old. And I was thinking about this again today when I was taking 212 out from the Twin Cities, the first leg of my drive out here. So in 1922, when Hubert Humphrey's turning 11 years old, the big news in Doland is that the first gravel road is going to be put in, connecting Doland all the way to the Twin Cities in one direction, all the way to Yellowstone Park in the other. And prior to that, the way Doland operated is the best way in and out was the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, and the railroad exploited that. They would set the prices for what they would pay farmers for their wheat, what they would pay ranchers for their livestock, and the farmers and the ranchers had no say in the matter. They really were at the mercy of these large capitalist forces because of their geographical isolation. And yeah, there were some roads, but if you tried to go at the wrong time, you ended up like my car did in 2019. So it's a big deal when this road is going to get built. And amazingly, who gets hired to do the graveling but a black-owned company out of Omaha? They are the subcontractors to the general contractor. And it's these two brothers, Otis and Leslie Shipman, who have a company in Omaha, who come up here to literally lay the gravel with their horse-drawn cart. That's a real photo of their crew from a few years earlier. And Hubert Humphrey had been brought up even in this insular parochial place with this very iconoclastic father. His father, who everybody called H.H. On the one hand, he just owned the local drugstore, and he, even was a little bit of a con man. He sold patent medicines. He had all these crazy ideas of selling opera records to get rich. Like, it's in the middle of a crop price disaster. Farmers are losing their land, and he thinks people are going to buy Enrico Caruso records, So, but he also was very genuinely idealistic. And he brought up Hubert Humphrey, as well as one of Humphrey's sisters, Frances, with the idea that everyone is equal. He would say to them, if you treat someone like dogs, don't be surprised if you get bitten. And Humphrey took that to heart. And so when the Shipman's crew shows up outside Doland in August of 22 to gravel the road, 11-year-old Hubert goes out to introduce himself to the crew, and he sort of befriends them, and they sort of befriend him. And at the end of the week, when they're getting ready to move on to their next job, and it's Saturday night, and they have their pay envelopes, and all the stores are open late in Doland, they take him around, they buy him strawberry soda, they buy extra copies of the Sunday newspapers he sells to make money, they take him to the pool hall, which is the most exciting, transgressive place, and then they move on to their next job. Now, I don't want to say that if you have an encounter like this at age 11, it's going to make you a hero of civil rights later on. But I do want to say that this was clearly transformational for Humphrey, because decades later, when he was dictating audio tapes that would become his autobiography, he told this story. Very little of it made it into the finished book. I found most of it in the appendix, because he wanted to have it somewhere in there. And he didn't even remember the crew's name. I figured out they were the shipments during my research. But that incident stayed with him. And it sets him on a path. And that path starts out at the University of Minnesota. He's interrupted by the Great Depression. He's to drop out. His family loses their store. They lose their home. And I want to show you, this was the most beautiful house in Doland. That's where they lived. They had lost that already during the crop price disaster. Then they lose their drugstore too. Humphrey drops out of school, comes back, the family's trying to start over in Huron, quickly gets a pharmacy credential because they need an official pharmacist, and it looks like that's where life is going to end. And he becomes very attracted to the New Deal policies of economic fairness, economic equality, activist government during that time. And eventually, at the age of about 26, he's able to finally go back and finish up his bachelor's degree in Minneapolis. But then the most important year of his life happens, and it's not in the Dakotas, and it's not in Minneapolis. Of all things, Hubert Humphrey goes to grad school at Louisiana State in Baton Rouge, and he goes there purely because he's married now. He is the first of what will become 4 kids, and he needs some money. And LSU gives him $400 to be a graduate assistant. And that may not sound like much now, but that's the equivalent of $8,500 in today's money. And so Hubert Humphrey goes to Baton Rouge. And for the first time, he lives in a Jim Crow society. And for the first time, unexpectedly, he meets Jewish classmates. And he studies under an exiled, part Jewish, anti-Nazi professor named Rudolph Eberle, who in class tells Humphrey a couple of things that will stay with Humphrey forever, because Humphrey writes them back to Eberle decades later in a letter congratulating Eberle on his 80th birthday. One of the things Eberle says is that the plight of the Jew in Nazi Germany is the plight of the black person in the Jim Crow South. The other thing he says in this 12-person seminar that Humphrey has with Eberle is one day, points across the room as it's dozen students and says, if we were in Germany, maybe 2 of you would have the courage to stand up to Hitler. And Humphrey goes back to Minneapolis with his master's degree now from LSU. With that, I think, is his mission statement, that he's going to be one of those 2. And when he gets back to Minneapolis, he sees something that he hadn't been aware of before, which is the degree of bigotry that's pervasive in Minneapolis itself. And he goes about educating himself. He needs to find some new Rudolph Eberles. And he finds them in 2 people. A former Pullman porter named Cecil Newman, who becomes the founder, editor, and publisher of Minneapolis's black newspaper, still being published to this day, and edited by his granddaughter, the Minneapolis Spokesman, and a Jewish attorney named Sam Shiner. And they become Humphrey's teachers. And here's the terrible kind of lesson that they're teaching Humphrey. You look at that photo on the top left. It looks like an enjoyable summer night, right? Well, I don't know if any of you in your studies of racial injustice in American history know that in the South there was a tradition of what were called lynching postcards. Anyone know about lynching postcards? Well, what it came from is that when someone was being lynched in the South, people didn't do it in stealth. They didn't do it under cover of night. They often did it as a kind of municipal celebration. People would bring picnics to the lynching site, and people would have cameras. And there's a whole set of postcards that were made of lynchings, of the body dangling or of the people celebrating. This is the Minneapolis equivalent of a lynching postcard. This is the mob that's gathered outside a bungalow that has recently been purchased by a black veteran of World War I who worked for the post office, Arthur Lee. And no sooner had his family moved in when, night after night, literally thousands of people besieged the home. This was just one night of many. And they're proud. They're wearing fedoras, they're wearing dresses, they're wearing ties. They're not ashamed. And eventually they did succeed after having poisoned the family's dog, desecrated the house with vandalism, made all sorts of other threats, physical and otherwise. The family gave up a year or two later and moved out of the house. So that was a part of Minneapolis history that Hubert Humphrey was starting to learn from Cecil Newman. That was back in 1931. As a young reporter, Cecil Newman covered that story for one of his earlier newspapers. And then you look at the photo on the top left, on top right there. I know it looks like a bowling team, right? Everyone's in their logo gear with the letter L on it, but it's not a bowling team. It's not an L for the American Legion, the veterans group. It's for a group called the Silver Legion, better known as the Silver Shirts. And Silver Shirts were a group explicitly modeled on Hitler's paramilitary group, the Brown Shirts. And the goal of the Silver Shirts and their leader, William Claude Pelley, was to turn America into an Aryan nation. Pelley's idea was that blacks should be sent back to Africa, Jews should be quarantined and sterilized so they'll just die off eventually. And then the country would just be for Aryans. And the Silver Shirts were a national organization, and Pelley himself was from North Carolina, but they had a huge following in Minneapolis. And their following in Minneapolis was not just the riffraff. It wasn't just people who had suffered greatly in the Depression and were looking in their desperation for someone to blame. And if you say blame the Jews, they'll blame the Jews. The head of the Board of Education went to Silver Shirt rallies. The head of the Businessmen's Association went to Silver Shirt rallies. Dentists, doctors, teachers, ministers went to Silver Shirt rallies. And speaking of ministers, the dominant religious voice in Minneapolis was this man, Reverend William Bell Riley, an erudite, refined, well-dressed, eloquent person who fancied himself as a different kind of evangelical, not a jack-leg preacher, not fire and brimstone, a church planter, an institution builder, and all the more dangerous for all those reasons because he was someone who firmly believed that Jews were trying to bring on world revolution. And he made that a legitimate part of discourse in Minneapolis. And then finally, when we think about this period of Minneapolis, you think about Charles Lindbergh, the aviation hero who was also the head of the America First Committee. That term goes back some decades. The America First Committee was an organization that wanted to keep America out of World War II because, as Lindbergh said in a famous, or I should say infamous speech in Des Moines in 1941, the only people who wanted America to get into war were the British, the Roosevelt administration, and the Jews. So that was the Minneapolis that Humphrey learned about from Cecil Newman and Sam Shiner. Because Cecil Newman had been reporting and writing editorials decrying racism for 15 years by the time Humphrey got to town. And Sam Shiner was a lawyer who'd been put on salary by the Jewish community of Minneapolis to basically do intelligence gathering on the extreme right wing in Minneapolis to try to get law enforcement to do something about it. And Cecil Newman and Sam Shiner were courageous people, and it takes nothing away from them to say that they both totally failed at what they wanted to do. They failed because Minneapolis was a city in which the blacks were 2% of the population, the Jews were about 2%, Catholics were maybe 15%. So it was a city in which the Protestant, Northern European, Scandinavian majority gave no quarter and saw no reason to give any quarter to any minority groups. And Humphrey, again, in the aftermath of World War II, runs for mayor for the second time. He ran and narrowly missed in 1943, but he runs in 1945, and that's important to keep in mind. Because remember those slides I was showing before from the liberation of the death camps? In 1945, that spring when he's running for mayor, that's when you go to the movies, that's what the newsreel shows you. Dwight Eisenhower, when American troops liberated death camps, brought in the journalists. He said, take still photos, shoot film. People on the home front won't believe it. They'll think it was propaganda. They'll think it was an exaggeration if we don't show them the piles of bodies. And so you go to have a date night out at the movies, it's going to start out seeing that newsreel. And you pick up the Minneapolis Star or Tribune, you're going to read an article by an American reporter about what was being found in the wake of the defeat of the Nazis. And you have all these GIs coming home and taking up the question that had been raised during the war, which is, what was our sacrifice for? What do we do about intolerance and inequality on the home front? And that's what Humphrey makes his big issue in the campaign. And even though he's never won elective office before, even though he's only a couple of years out of grad school at this point, even though he's only 6 years out of undergrad for that matter, running as a civil rights candidate, which would seem to be suicidal in a city with Minneapolis' history, at this moment in time, people are receptive to it. And he wins election. And once he's elected, he begins to not only reform Minneapolis with laws on fair housing and fair employment and a really valiant effort on police reform that tragically was never completed because he went on to the Senate so quickly. What Humphrey also does is begin to get a national name for himself on that issue. But not everyone is a Humphrey fan. And when people were so shocked about the extremist who killed Melissa Hortman, the Speaker of the Minnesota House of Representatives, and said, well, how could there be political violence in Minnesota? Well, I thought back to this day in February 1947, or this night, and Hubert Humphrey's coming home from a typical night on the mayoral rubber chicken circuit. And for a few months leading up to this, he'd been getting death threats because of his civil rights work. And at one point, even his police chief had tracked down Humphrey and his wife having dinner somewhere out of town and said, don't come back the usual way. Don't come back till I get a police car with you. We found out about a credible assassination threat. And ever since that threat came in, Humphrey travels everywhere with an armed police officer to guard him. And he's coming home this night, giving a few of the city council members a ride with him. And Humphrey, if those who remember him know, this man was genial to a fault. And so the police car gets up to the curb by Humphrey's house near the university campus. And Humphrey is like, oh, Officer Bartholomew, take the council members home. I'm fine from here. It's late. Starts walking up the pavement to his front door. Weird thing. The street light nearest to the house is out. So when Humphrey gets to the front door, he pulls out his key, and he's fiddling with his key in the lock. And right as that happens, 2 bullets whiz by his head. And he also noticed that inside the house, his pet dog had been barking. Well, Muriel, his wife, who's one of his great political advisors, was waiting up for him because when he came home late, that's when their political conversation would start every night. And she opens the door, having heard the noise, yanks him inside to safety, and then they try to put together what the heck just happened. And what they figured out is that their dog barking must have thrown off the concentration of the assassin. And that's why the assassin missed. And last strange thing, shortly after this, the Humphreys' pet dog Tippy vanishes, never to be found again. And the police go on the hunt for the assassin, and they eventually find a neo-Nazi white supremacist named Maynard Orlando Nelson. You can see his photo there. And in his apartment, they find guns. Of course, what would a neo-Nazi have but a German Luger, of course, knives, brass knuckles, and a map of World War III. He was hoping that a race war would start, and that would be World War III. So Humphrey knew firsthand, existentially, the risks of the stand he was taking. And the incredible, admirable thing about him is he was not deterred. He wasn't scared off. If anything, he just increased his involvement in the civil rights issue. And it takes him to Philadelphia in July 1948. That's when these paths, as I was saying before, converge. The Democrats are having their national convention. Harry Truman is going to be nominated. That's a given. A lot of people expect he's going to lose to the Republican Thomas Dewey anyway. But the big issue of that convention is whether the Democrats will finally endorse civil rights. And it's a big showdown because you have the southern wing of the party, the so-called Dixiecrats, embodied by Strom Thurmond and Fielding Wright, the governors of South Carolina and Mississippi, respectively, issuing a warning before the convention saying, if there's word one about civil rights in the Democratic platform, we're out of here. They already had rail cars reserved to go straight from Philadelphia to Alabama to have a convention and nominate Thurmond for president. And with that was the risk that the Democrats won't win any of the states in the South. And that means they probably won't win the White House at all. And then on the other hand, you can see this photo, A. Philip Randolph, he's right there looking very natty in his double-breasted suit and spats and fedora. He's leading protest marches every day, literally outside the front steps of the convention hall, saying that if you don't have a civil rights plank, if you don't move towards desegregating the military, my campaign of black draft resistance is going to amp up even more. And then in the middle is Harry Truman trying to navigate a path between Scylla and Charybdis on this issue, and hoping, in spite of his own great background on civil rights in 46 and 47, that like FDR, he can just make it go away, that he can put some language in the platform that'll be pallid and vague, and will let the Southerners say, this still lets us have Jim Crow. This still lets us have states' rights, which is the euphemism for segregation. Where Humphrey fits into this is as one of the leaders of a group of young liberals who decide, in spite of Truman saying that he doesn't want this plank, in spite of the Dixiecrats saying we're going to leave the convention and leave the whole party, they feel like this is an unavoidable issue, especially in the aftermath of World War II. And to again appreciate what this means for Humphrey, he is 37 years old. He's held one office in his entire life, the mayor of a mid-sized city, for a total of 3 years. He's a pipsqueak in national political terms. And one of Truman's point people in the convention goes up to Humphrey during the week of the convention and says, if you bring up your civil rights plank in the platform vote, your political career is over. Yeah, you're running for Senate in Minnesota this fall. The Democratic Party will pull all the support for you. We'll let you lose. So Humphrey's had that direct threat. And even so, with his whole barely begun political career on the line, on July 14th, 1948, he goes to the podium to deliver a speech that's going to try to make the case for why the delegates should vote against the risk of a Dixiecrat walkout, should vote against what Harry Truman, their own nominee, wants them to approve for the platform, and instead should endorse civil rights, the first time the Democratic Party ever would have done it. And, we're in an era now, just to contextualize, when conventions are very prepackaged. By the time it starts, everyone knows what's going to happen every minute, and they are dull, dull, dull. That wasn't the case back then. There were surprises in many conventions, including this one. And people were riveted. So when Hubert Humphrey is speaking to this convention, 60 million people are listening on live radio. TV has just begun along the Northeast coast on coaxial cable. 10 million people between Boston and Philly are watching on TV. 70 million people in the country. We're talking Super Bowl numbers, considering what the population of the entire country was at this time. And Humphrey has 10 minutes to close the deal. Just 10 minutes. And he makes all the important points. He says, we've been a liberal party, and a liberal party can't in good conscience be the party of segregation. And he says, we're in the Cold War now. Our foes in the Soviet Union are saying to these decolonizing countries, black and brown countries around the world, Marxist-Leninism, communism, is colorblind. Western democracy has Jim Crow. And Humphrey says, if we're going to win the argument for who these newly decolonizing countries should align with, we have to be morally correct. We have to be morally in order in our own house. And then he also points out pragmatically, hey, Harry Truman made all these promises on civil rights himself just a year or two ago. We're just reiterating his own program. So he's trying to say to the delegates who might be wavering, we're just hugging Harry Truman. We're just doing what he wanted to do himself. And then Humphrey has two of the greatest lines of his entire oratorical career. And they're not spontaneous lines. We tend to always think a speech is spontaneous if it's not from a teleprompter. You know, just to digress for a moment, when Dr. King told this, has the I have a dream riff in that speech, that wasn't spontaneous. He had done a version of that at a speech in Detroit a few months earlier. And the great gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who was also a civil rights activist, was on the podium that night, as she was again in Washington. And as King is going along with his speech at the March on Washington, you can hear in the background Mahalia Jackson shouting, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And then he repurposes and refines that riff he had first used in Detroit. And same thing with Humphrey with these lines I'm going to read to you in a moment. That these were phrases he'd been tweaking and trying out and changing and fine-tuning for months before this day. And fortunately for him and for America, he got them just right when everything was on the line. And he says, my friends, to those who say that we are rushing this issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years too late. 1948, right, minus 172 equals 1776. And then he goes on to say, to those who say that the civil rights program is an infringement on states' rights, I say this: the time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadow of states' rights and to walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. To which I say, there's a good book title in there somewhere. And in the aftermath of his platform plank being passed, the Dixiecrats walk, they leave the party, but Harry Truman has no choice now but to run as the candidate of civil rights. And he gives his last, 2 weeks after the convention, he issues 2 executive orders, desegregating the armed forces and desegregating the federal workforce. His last big weekend rally leading into Election Day is in Harlem, the capital of Black America. He is the first presidential candidate of a major party ever to give a campaign speech in Harlem. And heading into Election Day, when everyone thinks Truman's going to lose, he shockingly upsets Thomas Dewey. There's that iconic photograph of the mistaken Chicago Tribune headline that says Dewey defeats Truman, when in fact Truman had won. And he won explicitly because of the surge of black votes, because of his civil rights support. His victory margin came from Ohio, Illinois, and California, all of which were swing states then. And in every one of those states, his winning margin was provided by the increase in black people voting for the Democratic Party from FDR's candidacy in 44 to Truman's in 48. So he is the first civil rights president. And because he becomes unpopular for other reasons during his term, because conservatives win control of Congress, because of the way the committee system gives an enormous amount of power in Congress to Southern segregationists with a lot of seniority, he's never able to move forward at that time on the civil rights program. But 16 years after 1948, LBJ, with Martin Luther King and the mass movement involved, and A. Philip Randolph still around, enacts the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And as I said before, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, followed by the Fair Housing Act of 1966. And it also sets forth a permanent realignment of the parties, in which the Democratic Party, for whatever else its liabilities and flaws, which are many, becomes the party disproportionately of Black Americans and other non-white citizens, and in which the Republican Party becomes the party to which the former Democrats in the Jim Crow South migrate into being the Republican Party. And that's very much the configuration of our politics to this day. And I'm going to close there. I'm just going to add with one other pregnant thought for you. Not to stipulate anyone's thinking, but just a bit of a thought experiment. When I wrote this book, when I put together, or had my graphic designer wife put together this PowerPoint about the civil rights saga, I felt that I was conveying a story that Americans would be proud of and would consider across party lines one of America's great achievements. When Newt Gingrich became Speaker in early 1995, look at the speech he gave the first day, and he saluted the Democratic Party for what it had brought America to do on civil rights. That's Newt Gingrich, a dyed-in-the-wool conservative. We are now, arguably, at the end of the civil rights era in this country. You may believe that's the correct set of stances to take. You may not. But it does contravene something Dr. King optimistically said about the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice. We actually don't know. Arcs can bend in all sorts of ways. And so think about this history as you watch the court decisions, the state ballot measures, the executive orders, and consider what you think, in light of this history, is the correct path for this country. So that's your take-home exam from me, and it will not be graded. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, and for the challenge and the homework that you've sent us home with. As I said, we have some amazing political heritage here in South Dakota from both political parties.
Yeah.
And I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about Hubert Humphrey tonight. Professor Friedman has agreed to take a few questions from the audience, and I have a microphone, and we'll walk around and hand it to you so everyone can hear. And since I'm the facilitator, can I ask the first one?
Yes, yeah, facilitator's prerogative for sure.
Good. While the rest of you think of your insightful questions. Hubert Humphrey's 1948 speech was extremely hopeful and very positive and very optimistic. And yet, it seems like our political leaders today, from both sides of the aisle, lack that South Dakotan optimism.
Well, I agree.
What recommendations do you have?
I totally agree. I think that Humphrey's a really important model in a couple ways. One is he was a coalition builder. Humphrey, when he was mayor of Minneapolis and was assembling citizens' committees to work on civil rights, drew conservatives, liberals, Republicans, Democrats, labor union leaders, the management people they had struck against, Nisei Japanese, African American, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant. His idea was, if you agree with me on this one issue, we can work together, and we're just going to lay aside everything we disagree on other issues. That's one thing. The other thing is he was a patriot and he was an optimist, and in ways that I think later is very reflected in Dr. King's rhetoric and Barack Obama's rhetoric, was always appealing to America's better angels and to the idea that this is a creedal country in which anyone can belong if it believes in its highest values, and an aspirational country that may not be perfective but is endlessly positive. And he was hard-headed and savvy in many ways. A lot of people think of him as some kind of a cupcake politically. That's totally wrong. But he also never lost and never was afraid to express his deep love for the country. And I think you have to be a loving critic of the country if you're going to succeed at making change. You know, if the choice is going to be someone's version of patriotism and someone else's idea that the country is irremediably flawed and is so stuck in its original sin that it can never be bettered, then you're going to lose that argument with the middle ground of people. So, you know, I think there's a lot to learn from Humphrey's, you know, I was going to say political style, but it wasn't just a style. It was authentically who he was.
Thank you. Dr. Kemper.
I'm curious, in your research into Humphrey, does he ever express later in life any regrets for his actions at the 1964 convention when the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party attempts to unseat the all-white delegation and LBJ basically tasks him with cutting them off at the knees because he's afraid he's going to lose the nomination? Does he ever regret that later in life?
Just to fill everyone in, a little more context. So in the 1964 convention, the Democrats are going to nominate LBJ for a full term, right? Humphrey is going to be his vice presidential running mate. The big controversy at that convention is that Mississippi, like other southern states, still disenfranchised black citizens from voting. So all the Mississippi delegates were white. And one of the big vectors of civil rights activity in Mississippi in '64 was the creation of what was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, white and black civil rights activists together. And they had their own primary election, chose their own delegates, and sent a racially integrated delegation to the convention in Atlantic City and demanded to be seated. And by the way, something very similar happened in 1948. It's in my book. Anyway, so what happens is that LBJ, in that very ruthless LBJ way, says to Humphrey basically, you got to prove your loyalty to me. You're going to have to go to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and tell them, we're not going to seat them all. We're going to give them 2 seats. That's all they're going to get, and that's that. And in doing this, Humphrey ends up rupturing many friendships he had with people involved in that party. I have a good friend, the historian Julian Zelzer, who's doing a whole book now about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in '64. So I will defer. Julian will know for sure whether Humphrey ever apologized. In my reading of his later work, I didn't read nearly as much of his later life as I did of his life up through '48. I never saw him apologize for it. And I think that there's a good counter-argument to be made. The counter-argument for how brutal it seemed to only see 2 people from that delegation is as follows. As soon as those 2 people were seated, the segregated all-white delegation left the convention. And so effectively they were ousted. They self-deported, you might say, from the Democratic Convention. So what the Freedom Party wanted was actually accomplished, not by the means they wanted to. So that's number 1 of the downstream effects. Number 2 is that as a result of what happened that year, the Democratic Party, before its next convention, outlawed on its bylaws any racially segregated state delegations. So by the time they had their convention in '68, it's not even permissible within the party for that to happen. So whether Humphrey made the argument or not, I think there's an argument that could be made that in the moment it looked like a betrayal, but that in the not so distant future, it actually panned out pretty well for the cause of civil rights. But I have no doubt, and I'm writing for Julian's book, that that there's a lot of bad blood that still attaches to that, because Humphrey was such a crusader on civil rights. He was so beloved by liberals in this country that it was a shock. Like you of all people would go and sell us out, was the way it was portrayed. And Humphrey was also an ambitious politician, and if this was the price of getting on the presidential ticket, he was going to do it. People are flawed. That's why they're fun to write about. There's someone up here.
Thanks for being patient.
Yeah, thanks. Kind of going off of that question, I was just kind of curious about, like, in my research going into this, like reading about his relationship with LBJ and kind of in the 60s, is not necessarily fall from grace, but just kind of that worsening reputation. And I came across a 60s parody song from him about Tom Lehrer, whatever happened to
It's
Hubert.
quoted in the book.
And yeah, and I wanted to know if that was in the book, or like what was kind of explaining that sentiment of like, oh, what
Sure.
happened to Hubert? Like, you used to be
Yeah.
this big crusader, and then you kind of sold out to LBJ. What happened?
Exactly. This is a great question. And again, just to fill in and contextualize, Humphrey's real break with the liberals wasn't so much over the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. It was hugely over the Vietnam War. And Humphrey, like LBJ himself, was of two minds about the war. There are Oval Office tapes of LBJ talking to his mentor, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, and saying very early in becoming president, basically, why did those damn Kennedys stick me with this war? We cannot win this war. This is going to end tragically, and I don't know how to extricate myself, because if I do, all the Kennedy people are going to say I'm soft on communism. I'm weak, and that's the big sin in Kennedy world, is to look weak. And yet at the same time, Johnson escalated and never expressed those doubts publicly. And same thing with Humphrey. Humphrey, soon after becoming vice president, is one of a group of inner circle people in the Johnson White House who put together a memo basically saying to Johnson, this war can't be won. We've got to move for peace talks soon. It's just going to be a senseless loss of life on all sides. And even though it's saying things Johnson himself knows to be true, Johnson is so furious about being challenged that he then sort of exiles Humphrey. And in order to get back in Johnson's good graces, Humphrey has to get with the program, support the war, visit the troops in Vietnam. And that's part of it. But the other part, it's not just that Johnson bullied Humphrey. Humphrey was a cold warrior. Humphrey, for some very legitimate reasons having to do with the inside baseball of 1940s Minnesota politics, which I'll spare you, really believed that there was a communist effort to subvert this country, really believed there was a communist effort to take over non-communist countries elsewhere in the world, particularly developing countries. He believed that. And so he didn't have that hard a time persuading himself back into supporting the Vietnam War. Anyway, that's all the context. But because he supported the war, that totally broke him with white liberals. I mean, I remember my own parents playing that song by the musical satirist Tom Lehrer that mocked Hubert Humphrey. And my parents supported the other Minnesotan, Eugene McCarthy, the so-called peace candidate in the 1968 presidential primary. So I remember this all firsthand. And this was something that Humphrey later did apologize for. One of his really good friends for much of his life, then they had a rupture over Vietnam, then they reconciled, was another great South Dakotan, George McGovern. And after they had reconciled in the mid-70s, Humphrey and McGovern would go for walks many mornings in the D.C. suburb where they both lived. And I found this oral history McGovern had given in which he recounts taking a walk with Humphrey one day. And Humphrey, unprompted, says, George, I know everyone says that I supported the war just because of Lyndon, but, I wouldn't do it just for that. I really thought it was the right policy at that time. I realize now I was completely wrong. It's the biggest mistake I ever made. But he at least wanted his friend McGovern to know he wasn't just being a hypocrite about it. But his reputation suffered and has never recovered. Lyndon Johnson's reputation has been restored. If any of you know the HBO show or the play on which it's based called All the Way with Bryan Cranston from Breaking Bad playing LBJ, if not, this is some homework you'll love doing. Find the HBO production called All the Way, and it's about Lyndon Johnson and the Civil Rights Act of '64. And stuff like that was a revelation to people in America who just thought of Humphrey. I thought of Johnson for his horrible policies in Vietnam. And Johnson's reputation has been restored. It's not like he's angelic, but people can hold two truths with him. Civil rights and the Great Society on one hand, Vietnam on the other. With Humphrey, one of the reasons I want to write this book is why doesn't he get a reconsideration? He was out there bravely on civil rights, facing assassination when Lyndon Johnson in the 40s was still a segregationist. So, come on, people. Anyway, so I hope that in a long-winded way answered your question.
Do you know if he ever heard the song?
I have no idea if he heard the song. I know that all the ridicule he got really pierced him because it came up in some of the speeches he gave later. But you know what? I don't feel sorry about that. If you're in public life, what goes with it, you get the adulation and you also get the disses, It can't be just one or the other.
Was there any time during your study of young Humphrey that you had an aha moment that you said, oh my gosh, I have to put this in the book, but maybe I shouldn't?
There was nothing that I felt like I shouldn't put in there. I had a lot of aha moments. One of the biggest was finding out about his encounter with the Shipman road crew. That was a really big aha moment. Finding out the details of what happened in the Dakotas in the 20s and what it meant not only to his family, but the way both of these states got dropped down the economic elevator shaft. Like I said, a decade before the Great Depression. I didn't know that history. I thought of the Great Depression as post-1929. So for me, that was an aha. His relationship with Rudolph Aberle, there's a lot of discovery along the way. If anything, I wanted to make sure that I didn't have a portrait that was read as too adulatory. So I made sure, like in the prologue of the book, the prologue starts with him near death, his reputation in tatters, giving a commencement address at the University of Pennsylvania, and being very aware that he's now an object of ridicule and scorn and is dying as well. So I wanted to get that out there at the start. Like, do I know that he failed on Vietnam? Yes, reader, I know. But now there's this other part you don't know, dear reader. And when I found even little things that, gave more grayness to his character, I was glad to put that stuff in because it gave him shading. Even if it's like first New Year's Eve when he's mayor, he gets drunk and ends up puking out the window of his car on New Year's Eve. I wanted to put that in. When there are letters between him and Muriel that make it clear that their sexual life was suffering because of how busy his work life was. And I put that in not to be salacious, but to give a sense of the complexity and the whole person as well, and just to show like I'm not averting my eye from any of the negatives. And in that inside baseball, communist versus anti-communist battles in Minnesota politics in the mid-40s, even though I agree that the anti-communist liberals like him had the right position, he ended up turning on people who'd been very loyal to him. And there were, brutally broken friendships as a result. So I tried to, everywhere I could, far from effacing stuff that could be read as, his negative side, making sure that I put it in so that then the admirable side shows up in contrast. If everything is admirable, then nothing's admirable. You have to have the yin and the yang.
Let's take one more if we've got one. No, but make it good.
Okay. All right. It's interesting and inspiring to me that Humphrey was so young when he got started. And I work with our students here, and you're a professor as well. Just in speaking with them, I think as younger people, they feel a little disenfranchised and disconnected from the political system and from their government. Is there, maybe in your personal opinion, but also in the things you learned writing and researching Humphrey, is there any advice you have for them or any way to inspire them to be active in spite of that?
Yeah. Well, I think that, what's called retail politics, which is localized person-to-person politics, really does matter. Partly because turnouts in many elections are quite low. And so an individual at a young age getting involved, whether it's with a party or with an advocacy group of some kind, actually can end up feeling like you have a lot more power than you think you have. I mean, we're very cynical in thinking that it's just the social media feed, or in previous generation, the TV ads or direct mail flyers that affect people. And certainly a lot of people are affected that way. But people are also affected by tactile, person-to-person politicking that can happen at the local level. And also, as in any field, you can't vault into being effective on a national level if you don't start somewhere. You know, we all have fantasies, at least those of us like me who love football, you know, of, oh, if I could be in the NFL. But realistically, what's anyone's route to the NFL? They play Pop Warner, they play high school, they play college, and if they're good enough, they get drafted. They're going to football camp every summer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No one, you know, snaps their fingers and is in the NFL. And so I think the same thing is true politically. And I also think that people who work in politics are kind of starved for having input from young people, from having energy from young people. So I guess what I would say is don't start with the cynicism and assume that it's correct and assume that there's no place or assume that you'll have no effect. Try it out. The worst that happens is your cynicism is reinforced, and then you say, okay, I tried it and it didn't work, but at least I know. But the most tragic thing would be to remain in this kind of passive, inert position. And I mean this regardless of where your politics are on the left to right spectrum, but to just assume that there's no role to play, nothing purposeful to do, and sit with that impotence and passivity. Because that's destructive for the society. That's not just about left or right or Republicans or Democrats. That's about a healthy society.
I think that is an excellent final question. So I think that's the right way to end it. Professor Friedman, we are so grateful to have you here. And we have just put together a small little swag bag
Thank you.
to help you remember South Dakota, to maybe get rid of those memories of being stuck in the mud road.
That's one of my proudest days. I showed my journalism class that photo and say, if you want to do this work, you got to get through stuff like this.
You got to get a little dirty.
Yeah, that's one of my best days ever.
We hope that you will come back to South Dakota soon. Please join with me in thanking Professor Friedman for his insightful comments.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you for joining us. There is still plenty of food. Fill your pockets, and please be here next year. We'd love to see you.